Velociraptors raise an abandoned Triceratops. What follows will shock you. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The storm raged violently over the dense, prehistoric jungle. Lightning cracked through the sky, illuminating the towering ferns and ancient trees, while the wind howled through the undergrowth, bending branches until they nearly snapped. Thunder rumbled across the land like the growl of an unseen beast, shaking the ground beneath the enormous feet of the Triceratops herd as they moved urgently through the downpour. Mothers nudged their young forward, their massive horns lowering protectively as they searched for shelter. The rain made the ground slick, turning the once solid earth into a treacherous landscape of mud and unstable footing. Among the herd, a particularly large female, her scales gleaming with moisture, hovered anxiously over her clutch of eggs. She had laid them days ago in the safety of a concealed nesting ground, but the storm had changed everything. A powerful gust of wind howled through the trees, sending leaves and debris flying in every direction. The Triceratops cow let out a distressed bellow as one of her eggs, still unhatched, was swept away from the nest, tumbling down the rain-slicked hillside. It rolled, bouncing over rocks and roots, disappearing into the dense foliage below. She tried to follow, but the herd's movement was relentless, and the dangers of staying behind were too great. Predators lurked in the storm, waiting for the weak and the lost. The egg came to rest at the base of a massive tree, half buried in mud, unnoticed in the chaos of the storm. Hours passed, and as the rain began to subside, the jungle fell eerily silent. From within the shell, movement stirred. A faint crack echoed in the stillness. Then another. Slowly, the fragile surface splintered apart, and a small, trembling head pushed through. A Triceratops hatchling, no larger than a human child, emerged into the world. Its tiny, curved horns were barely visible above its wet, scaly skin, and its eyes blinked open to take in the strange, unfamiliar world around it. It chirped weakly, instinctively calling for its mother, but there was no response, only the distant drip of rainwater falling from the leaves above. The hatchling took its first shaky steps, its small legs struggling against the thick mud. It had no idea where it was or why it was alone, only that something inside it told it to move. It stumbled forward, chirping again, its calls met with silence. Alone and vulnerable, it wandered through the jungle, unaware that it had just stepped into one of the most dangerous territories of all, the hunting grounds of a velociraptor pack. The jungle was still wet with the remnants of the storm when Nyx, the leader of the raptor pack, lifted her head to sniff the air. Her nostrils flared as she detected something new, something foreign. Beside her, her packmates crouched low, their golden eyes scanning the trees. They had spent the night sheltering from the storm and were now on the move again, hunting for anything that had been weakened by the night's chaos. Nyx moved first, her slender, feathered body slipping through the undergrowth with practiced ease. She was a veteran hunter, a survivor of countless battles, and every movement she made was calculated and silent. The other raptors followed her lead, their movements perfectly synchronized. They were a family, bonded not by blood but by survival. And survival meant the relentless pursuit of prey. Then they heard it, a faint, repetitive chirping, a sound that did not belong in their domain. Nyx narrowed her eyes and crept forward, following the sound until she reached a small clearing. There, in the middle of the damp earth, was a creature that should not have been alone. The hatchling. It stood unsteadily, its tiny tail dragging in the mud, its large, dark eyes wide with confusion. It had no scent of its own kind nearby, no mother, no herd. It was alone, perfect target. The raptors instinctively fanned out, their movements predatory and swift. One of the younger males let out a low, eager growl, his claws flexing as he prepared to lunge. But Nyx didn't move. Something about the tiny creature made her pause. It wasn't fear, it was something else. The hatchling looked up at her, completely unaware of the danger it was in. Its eyes, large and round, held no fear, no understanding of what these creatures were or what they could do to it. Nyx lowered her snout slightly, sniffing at the air between them. The hatchling chirped again, taking an unsteady step toward her. It stumbled, landing in the mud, but instead of retreating, it simply blinked up at her expectantly. The other raptors were waiting for Nyx's signal, expecting her to strike. But she didn't. Instead, she let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a call for attack, but something else. A warning. The younger male raptors hesitated, glancing at each other in confusion. This was prey, wasn't it? Why was their leader stopping? Nyx took another step forward and nudged the hatchling with her snout. It let out a small chirp and wobbled upright again. It was pathetic, weak, defenseless. Yet, something in Nyx's instincts told her to spare it. One of the older raptors, a seasoned hunter named Rylos, hissed under his breath. "Nyx, what are you doing?" His voice was a low growl. "It's prey." Nyx's yellow eyes flickered toward him. "Not anymore." Rylos bared his teeth slightly, but he didn't argue. He knew better than to question Nyx's decisions openly. Still, the tension in the pack was palpable. They were killers, hunters. Raising something that wasn't one of their own? That was unheard of. But Nyx had made her choice. She turned, gesturing for the others to move. The pack hesitated for a moment before following her lead, slinking back into the jungle's shadows. The hatchling, completely unaware of how close it had come to death, let out another small chirp and stumbled after them, its tiny feet struggling to keep up. Nyx glanced over her shoulder once, then let out a softer, almost resigned sigh. It would learn, or it would die. Either way, it belonged to the pack now. The jungle was alive with movement as the Velociraptor pack slipped through the dense foliage, their bodies weaving effortlessly between towering ferns and low-hanging vines. They moved with silent precision, their clawed feet barely disturbing the damp earth beneath them. The pack's hierarchy was clear. Nyx led at the front, her golden eyes scanning for threats, while the others followed in a loose formation, their senses sharp and alert. But among them, struggling to keep up, was something entirely out of place. Toru, the young Triceratops hatchling, wobbled clumsily behind the raptors, his small legs sinking into the muddy terrain. He tripped on an exposed root and fell forward with a startled squeak, landing face first into the dirt. A few of the younger raptors snickered, their sleek bodies darting past him without a second glance. Toru shook himself off, blinking away the humiliation as he tried again. Nyx watched from the front of the line, her expression unreadable. She had expected this. The hatchling was not built for speed or stealth. He was a walking contradiction in their world. Yet, despite everything, she had made the choice to keep him. Now, it was up to him to prove he could survive. Behind her, Rylos let out a sharp breath. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, his eyes narrowing as Toru tripped yet again. "He slows us down. He's learning," Nyx replied without looking back. Rylos scoffed. "He's a Triceratops. Nyx. He will never be one of us." Nyx stopped suddenly, turning her piercing gaze on him. "Then he will adapt." There was a weight to her words, an unspoken warning that silenced any further arguments. The pack continued forward, but the tension lingered. Toru, oblivious to the discussion, had finally managed to catch up, panting from exertion. He looked up at Nyx expectantly, his small horns barely developed, his eyes full of determination. He didn't understand their ways, their rules, but he wanted to. He wanted to belong. That night, the pack settled in a shallow cave nestled between the roots of an ancient tree. The jungle hummed with nocturnal life, distant calls of creatures, the rustle of unseen predators moving through the undergrowth. The raptors curled together, their bodies forming a tight-knit circle for warmth and protection. Toru, unsure of where he fit, stood awkwardly at the edge of the group. He lowered himself to the ground but remained outside their circle, watching them with uncertainty. Nyx, half awake, noticed his hesitation. With a slow, deliberate motion, she shifted slightly, leaving a small gap between herself and the others. It was an invitation. Toru hesitated, then cautiously stepped closer, settling into the space she had made for him. He curled up, his small body pressed against the warmth of the raptors, his breathing finally steady. For the first time since hatching, he felt safe. The days that followed were a brutal test of survival. Toru was not a hunter, and that fact became painfully obvious during the pack's first hunt after his arrival. The raptors moved like shadows, slinking through the tall grass as they stalked a group of unsuspecting Hypsilophodon near a watering hole. Nyx signaled the others to spread out, their bodies low to the ground, eyes locked onto their prey. Toru, not understanding the need for silence, let out an excited chirp and took a few loud steps forward. The sound shattered the stillness. The Hypsilophodon scattered in an instant, their small, bird-like forms sprinting into the trees before the raptors could react. The hunt was ruined. A tense silence followed. Rylos let out a low snarl, his frustration evident. Nyx sighed, turning to Toru, who looked confused and a little guilty. "Toru," she said, her tone patient but firm, "you must be quiet when we hunt." Toru tilted his head, his small tail swishing against the ground. He didn't understand the importance of stealth. His kind were not hunters. They were grazers, built for endurance and defense, not for striking from the shadows. But Nyx was not ready to give up on him. That night, as the pack rested beneath the silver glow of the moon, Nyx sat beside Toru, observing him closely. He was different. He would never hunt like them, never stalk prey the way a raptor did. But he had strengths of his own. "Come," she said, standing. Toru blinked sleepily but obeyed, following her to a clearing surrounded by fallen logs. Nyx gestured toward one. "Charge it." Toru looked at her, confused. "Use your weight," she instructed. Hesitantly, Toru lowered his head and pushed against the log. Barely moved. Nyx circled him. "Harder." Toru huffed, digging his feet into the earth. He pushed again, his muscles straining. The log shifted slightly. Nyx watched, her gaze sharp. Again, Toru tried once more, and this time, something changed. His frustration, his determination, it all came together. He let out a grunt, lowered his growing horns, and slammed into the log with full force. The log toppled over, crashing into the dirt. Nyx's eyes gleamed with approval. Toru looked at her, his breath coming fast. "You are not weak," she told him. "You are different, but you will survive." Toru didn't understand all her words, but he understood the meaning. For the first time, he felt like he belonged. The change was gradual but undeniable. Toru was still clumsy, still slow, still unlike the others. But he was learning. The next time the raptors hunted, he didn't try to sneak with them. He waited. When the prey bolted, he charged from the opposite direction, cutting off their escape route. His sheer size, even as a juvenile, was enough to startle their target into hesitation. And hesitation meant death. Rylos, though still skeptical, had to admit it was effective. "He might not be useless after all," he muttered. Nyx only smirked. Toru, unaware of the whispered doubts, only cared about one thing. He was finally proving himself. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Toru and the younger raptors played in the shallows of a riverbed, snapping at fish that darted between the rocks. The air was light, for once free of the tension of survival. Nyx watched from a distance, her gaze thoughtful. She had taken a risk keeping Toru. She had fought her instincts, defied the rules of the wild. And yet, something told her it had been the right choice. She had seen strength in him, something that went beyond simple survival. She had a feeling he would change more than just the pack. He would change everything. The days stretched into weeks, and as the jungle pulsed with life, Toru slowly grew into his place within the pack. He would never be as fast as the raptors, nor could he hunt the way they did, but he had begun to understand their rhythm, their silent signals, their coordinated movements. He had adapted in his own way, a creature of strength among creatures of speed. And though some of the pack still regarded him as an outsider, he was no longer seen as a burden. Nyx watched his progress with quiet satisfaction. She had known from the beginning that Toru would never be like them, but she had chosen to see what he could become rather than what he wasn't. His brute strength had already proven valuable, and as the pack prepared for their next hunt, she decided it was time to test him in a way that would determine his true place among them. The target that day was a Parasaurolophus, a massive herbivore that roamed in small groups near the jungle's open fields. It was larger than their usual prey but vulnerable if taken down correctly. The plan was simple. The raptors would chase it toward an ambush, where Toru would use his weight to block its escape. As the pack moved into position, Toru felt his heart pounding. He had trained for this, learned their ways, proved himself over and over again. But this was different. This was a real hunt, and failure could mean starvation for the pack. He lowered his stance, waiting as the raptors fanned out through the trees. A signal from Nyx, then chaos. The raptors sprang into action, their lithe bodies cutting through the undergrowth with precision. The Parasaurolophus bellowed in alarm, its powerful legs kicking up dust as it tried to flee. The pack harried it from the sides, forcing it toward Toru's position. Toru braced himself. Then, at the last moment, instinct took over. He charged. His hooves thundered against the ground as he lunged forward, throwing his weight against the massive creature's flank. The impact sent a shockwave through the air, knocking the Parasaurolophus off balance just enough for the raptors to strike. Claws flashed, teeth tore into flesh, and within moments, the battle was over. The pack stood victorious, and Toru, panting heavily, stood among them. For the first time, he wasn't just tolerated. He was one of them. Rylos, ever skeptical, gave a slow nod. "Not bad," he muttered, barely concealing his approval. Nyx let out a small, satisfied growl. "He's ours." The raptors feasted, and Toru, though unused to their way of eating, joined them in his own way, tearing at the broad jungle leaves and soft bark nearby, finding his own sustenance beside his pack. They were different, but they were family. Yet, deep in the jungle, unseen eyes watched, and fate had more in store for Toru than he could ever imagine. The jungle was alive that night, but something about the air felt different. The usual hum of insects and distant roars of nocturnal hunters seemed muted, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Toru, resting at the edge of the pack, shifted uneasily. Something about the night felt wrong. Then the scent hit them, a deep, musky odor carried on the wind, something familiar, yet foreign. Nyx lifted her head sharply, nostrils flaring. The pack was instantly on alert, their bodies tense, golden eyes flashing in the moonlight. Then came the sound, a low, resonant call, deep and echoing like a drum against the earth. Toru's entire body went rigid. He knew that sound. From the darkness, shapes emerged. Massive, slow-moving figures stepped into the clearing. Their skin was thick and ridged, their horns gleaming under the pale moonlight. Toru's heart pounded in his chest. They were Triceratops, his kind, his blood, and at the front of the herd stood a massive female, her eyes locking onto him with something that sent a strange jolt through his body. Recognition. Toru didn't move. The pack around him tensed, waiting for his reaction. The female took a slow step forward, sniffing the air between them. Her deep, amber eyes held something Toru couldn't quite understand. Relief? Sadness? Hope? And then she called to him. A soft, gentle rumble. A sound meant for him alone. Toru staggered backward, confused, his mind racing. This was the family he had lost, the kind he had been born into. But when he turned his head, he saw Nyx, and he realized something terrifying. He didn't belong to them anymore. The raptors stood frozen, watching the silent exchange between Toru and the herd. They were predators, and these creatures were prey. But even they could sense that something deeper was happening. Nyx, however, remained unreadable. Her piercing gaze was locked onto Toru, but she said nothing. The female Triceratops took another step forward, this time making a low, insistent sound, a mother calling her lost child home. The herd moved cautiously behind her, their massive bodies shifting as they waited for his response. Toru's breath came fast. His instincts screamed at him. This was where he should be. These creatures were like him. But as he stared at them, a strange feeling crept into his chest. He didn't know them. They were strangers to him now. He turned his gaze back to Nyx, searching for something. An answer, permission, a reason to stay. She gave him none. She simply watched. It was his choice. Toru took a slow step forward, his heart hammering in his chest. The herd remained still, waiting. He took another step. Then, from the trees, everything changed. A shriek cut through the night, high and sharp. Predators. A massive Tyrannosaurus burst from the jungle, its enormous head swinging toward the Triceratops herd. Its yellow eyes gleamed hungrily as it let out a bone-rattling roar. Chaos erupted. The Triceratops bellowed in panic, their massive bodies shifting into a defensive formation. The raptors hissed, their instincts kicking in instantly. But Toru didn't hesitate. He charged. The moment his feet hit the earth, he knew where he belonged. Not behind the Triceratops, not running to safety, but fighting. He barreled forward, his small but powerful body slamming into the predator's leg with all the force he could muster. The Tyrannosaurus stumbled, caught off guard, its head swinging toward him in surprise. The raptors, seeing their chance, moved in. Nyx lunged first, her claws raking across the beast's eye. Rylos followed, his teeth sinking into the exposed flesh of its neck. The rest of the pack struck with coordinated fury, weaving in and out of the attack. The Triceratops herd watched in astonishment as Toru, one of their own, fought alongside the raptors. By the time the battle ended, the Tyrannosaurus was bleeding and retreating into the jungle, defeated. Toru stood panting, covered in scratches and mud, his muscles burning from exertion. When he turned, his birth herd was watching him. They had seen everything. The massive female, the one who had called to him, held his gaze for a long, silent moment. Then, she lowered her head in silent acknowledgement. Farewell. Without another word, the herd turned and disappeared into the jungle. Toru watched them go, his chest tightening. He had made his choice. When he turned back, Nyx was waiting. She met his gaze and gave a slow, approving nod. And just like that, Toru had never been more certain of where he belonged. The jungle had returned to its usual hum of life, but Toru felt different. Something inside him had shifted, as if the very ground he stood on had changed beneath his feet. He had watched his own kind disappear into the darkness, creatures who had once been his family in another life. And yet, as he turned back to his pack, his real family, he felt no regret. Nyx stood at the front, her golden eyes watching him with an expression he couldn't quite place. Rylos, ever skeptical, gave a snort. Well, he muttered, flicking his tail, guess we have our answer. Toru hesitated, glancing once more toward the direction the Triceratops had vanished. A part of him had expected something different. Some lingering pull, some ache that told him he had made the wrong choice. But there was none. He had chosen this life, and now there was no turning back. Nyx stepped closer, her piercing gaze softening slightly. You made your choice, she said simply. Toru nodded, standing taller. I did. The pack moved through the jungle again, but something had changed. For the first time, Toru wasn't just following behind them, he was moving with them. He was one of them. The days that followed were filled with new lessons, new challenges, and an unspoken bond that had finally solidified between him and the rest of the pack. Where once he had struggled to find his place, now he carved his own. He wasn't a raptor, and he never would be. But he was something else, something stronger, something different. Hunting became more fluid. Instead of chasing prey, he helped guide it. When the pack went after a flock of smaller dinosaurs, Toru blocked their escape, using his size to funnel them into the raptors' waiting claws. His speed would never match theirs, but his sheer presence on the battlefield was becoming a weapon all its own. Even Rylos had to admit it. He's useful, he grumbled after a successful hunt. Nyx smirked. Took you long enough to see it. But Toru knew his role in the pack wasn't just about hunting. He had become their protector. In the jungle, danger lurked around every corner, from rival raptors to larger, more powerful predators. And it wasn't long before they would need him more than ever. One evening, just as the sun began to dip below the towering trees, a scent drifted through the air, one that made Nyx stop mid-step. The pack halted, their bodies tensing as they inhaled the musky, bitter odor. Rylos bared his teeth. Something's hunting. Toru's muscles tightened. Not something. Some things. Before anyone could react, the jungle erupted in chaos. A blur of dark bodies surged from the undergrowth. Another pack of velociraptors, larger and leaner, their eyes gleaming with malice. Nyx let out a sharp bark, signaling for her pack to form up. This was not a random encounter. This was an ambush. Toru instinctively moved to the side, lowering his head as the rival raptors surrounded them. They were outnumbered. These weren't just rogues, they were organized. From the shadows, a massive raptor stepped forward. He was taller than Nyx, his scales scarred from past battles, his snout twisted into a cruel grin. "Took us a while to find you, Nyx," he drawled, his voice dripping with amusement. Nyx didn't flinch. "Varos." Toru could feel the tension radiating off her. She knew this raptor. "You're in our territory," Nyx said, her voice calm but edged with warning. Varos tilted his head. "Funny. I was going to say the same thing." His yellow eyes flicked to Toru. "But I suppose things have changed since you started adopting strays." A few of his pack members snickered, their sharp teeth flashing in the dimming light. Toru's tail flicked, but he said nothing. He wouldn't give them the reaction they wanted. Varos took a slow step forward. "Here's the deal, Nyx. Leave. This jungle belongs to us now." Nyx held her ground. "We've lived here for years." "Not anymore." The words hung in the air like a threat. The pack tensed, prepared for a fight. Then, without warning, Varos struck. The jungle exploded with movement. Raptors clashed in a frenzy of claws and teeth, snarls and shrieks piercing the thick air. Nyx lunged at Varos, their bodies colliding as they tumbled into the undergrowth, locked in a vicious battle for dominance. Toru's instincts roared to life. He wasn't built for speed, but he was built for force. As two of Varos' raptors lunged for Rylos, Toru charged, his growing horns slamming into one of them and sending it sprawling. The second raptor turned toward him, eyes narrowing. Toru braced himself. The raptor lunged. Toru dodged the first swipe but felt claws rake across his shoulder. He grunted in pain but retaliated immediately, whipping his heavy tail and sending the attacker flying into a tree. Rylos, panting from his own fight, gave Toru a sharp nod before diving back into the fray. Nearby, Nyx and Varos were still locked in combat, their bodies twisting and turning in a brutal dance of survival. Varos was strong, but Nyx was faster. She darted around him, avoiding his slashing claws, waiting for an opening. Toru saw it before she did. Varos lunged, too fast, too reckless. Toru acted without thinking. He charged forward with all the power in his growing muscles. His hooves thundered against the jungle floor, his head lowering as he slammed into Varos' exposed side. The impact sent Varos crashing to the ground. Nyx wasted no time. She leapt onto him, teeth flashing as she sank them into his exposed throat. Varos let out a strangled gasp. Then silence. The battle was over. The remaining rival raptors hesitated, their leader gone, their advantage shattered. Slowly, one by one, they backed away before vanishing into the jungle. Nyx stood over Varos' still body, breathing heavily, her golden eyes dark with exhaustion. The pack gathered around her, waiting. Then, she turned to Toru. "You saved us." Toru swallowed, still catching his breath. "I did what I had to." Nyx gave him a long, unreadable look before nodding. "You didn't just prove yourself today. You proved why we need you." Toru felt something settle in his chest, a certainty he had never known before. He was no longer just surviving. He had found his purpose. That night, as the pack rested, Toru sat awake, gazing up at the stars that flickered through the jungle canopy. Everything had changed, yet everything felt right. He had been born into one family, but he had chosen another. And now, he was no longer just a Triceratops raised by raptors. He was one of them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he would face them with his pack at his side. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged. Here is batch 5, 1,500 words, of the script in flowing paragraphs. The jungle was still damp with the remnants of the night's battle, the scent of blood and torn foliage lingering in the air. The pack had survived. Varos was dead, his influence over the rival raptors broken, and for the first time in weeks, Nyx and her pack had peace. But peace in the wild was always temporary. Toru stood at the edge of the clearing, his body aching from the fight. His wounds were minor, scratches, bruises, but they were reminders of what had happened, of what he had done. He had helped Nyx defeat a tyrant. He had fought for his family, not just as a follower, but as an equal. Nyx approached him, her gaze steady. "We move at dawn," she said simply. Toru nodded. The pack could not stay here. Varos' old allies might return, or worse. Other predators could smell the blood in the air and come looking for an easy kill. They needed fresh territory, somewhere safer. Rylos let out a grumble from where he was tending to a bite wound on his shoulder. "Do we even have a plan? Or are we just running?" Nyx flicked her tail. "We move north, toward the river," Rylos scoffed. "And what if that's someone else's hunting ground?" "Then we make it ours," Nyx said, her voice sharp. Toru glanced between them. He had spent so much time proving himself, learning their ways. But there was one thing he had never questioned: what came next? The pack had spent its existence fighting for survival, claiming and losing territory, moving from one threat to another. Was that all there was? Would they ever truly find a home? But he didn't voice his doubts. Not yet. At dawn, the pack began their journey. The jungle stretched endlessly before them, a world of ancient trees and tangled vines, of towering cliffs and hidden dangers lurking in the shadows. Toru moved with them now, no longer struggling to keep up. His strength had become an asset, his presence accepted. But acceptance was not the same as purpose. They traveled for hours, weaving through narrow ravines and rocky outcrops, always moving, always searching. The river was their goal, a source of water, prey, and protection. If they could claim it, they could rebuild. But Toru had a growing unease deep in his chest. He had spent so long proving himself to the pack, but now he wondered, had he ever truly belonged? He was stronger than before, faster, smarter. But he was still different. The others had grown used to him, but when he looked at Nyx, he saw something else in her eyes. A question that had never been spoken aloud. Did she expect him to leave? The river was closer than they thought. By nightfall, the distant rush of water filled the air, a rhythmic pulse against the quiet rustling of leaves. Relief flickered through the pack as they approached the clearing, their bodies tense but hopeful. But then Toru felt it, a vibration through the earth so faint he almost missed it. His instincts screamed at him. Something was wrong. Nyx noticed it too. She halted, raising her snout, eyes narrowing. The others followed suit, a silent tension settling over them. The river was just ahead, shimmering under the moonlight. And then the silence shattered. A roar, deep, primal, and all-consuming. From the darkness, a massive shape emerged. Tyrannosaurus Rex. It moved like a living nightmare, its hulking form tearing through the undergrowth as if the jungle itself bowed before it. Scars lined its thick hide. Its teeth gleamed under the dim light, each one the size of a dagger. The pack instantly reacted. Nyx snarled, backing the others into formation. They had fought predators before, but this was different. This wasn't just a threat. This was death incarnate. Toru felt something deep in his bones. A primal instinct, a warning passed down through his bloodline. The ancestors of Triceratops had fought creatures like this for millions of years. He was not just a survivor, he was a challenger. The Tyrannosaurus let out another deafening roar before charging. The pack scattered. Nyx darted left, Rylos dove into the brush. The younger raptors fled to the trees. But Toru stood his ground. This was his fight. The impact was like thunder. Toru lowered his head and charged. His horns aimed for the Tyrannosaurus' exposed chest. The sheer force of his body colliding with the predator sent shockwaves through the ground. The T-Rex stumbled, caught off guard. It had expected prey, not resistance. Toru didn't stop. He twisted, using his growing strength to slam his body into the larger beast's side. The raptors, seeing their opening, struck like lightning. Nyx lunged for its throat, claws tearing at exposed scales. Rhilos darted between its legs, snapping at its softer underbelly. But the Tyrannosaurus was not so easily defeated. It twisted sharply, its massive head swinging toward Toru. Toru barely had time to react before the beast's jaws clamped down on his frill. Pain erupted through his skull as the predator's teeth scraped against bone. But Toru did not fall. He roared, his strength surging as he threw all his weight into the ground, twisting free from the grip. Nyx saw the opportunity and struck again. Her claws raked across its eye. The Tyrannosaurus bellowed in agony, staggering backward. Toru seized his chance. With a final, earth-shaking charge, he slammed his horns into its exposed chest, driving it back toward the river. The Tyrannosaurus, dazed, injured, and outmatched for the first time in its life, took a step back, right into the rushing water. It lost its footing. The beast toppled into the river, its massive body crashing into the current. The pack watched as the water carried it away, thrashing but unable to regain control. Then it was gone. Silence fell over the jungle. They had won. The pack stood in stunned silence, their breaths heavy, their bodies trembling with exhaustion. The riverbank was scarred from the battle, the earth torn apart from the weight of giants. Toru exhaled slowly, feeling the pain in his limbs, the ache in his bones. He had faced death itself and survived. Nyx stepped forward, her expression unreadable. She looked at the river, then at Toru. "You saved us," she said. Toru met her gaze, his breath steady. "I did what I had to." Nyx studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "You're not just one of us anymore," she said. "You are our protector." The words settled deep in his chest, heavier than any battle he had fought. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was purpose. That night, as the pack rested, Toru stood by the river, watching the water move endlessly through the jungle. He thought about where he had come from, what he had lost, and what he had gained. He had been born into one world, but he had chosen another. He was not just a Triceratops. He was not just a raptor. He was something more. And for the first time, he truly understood. He was exactly where he was meant to be. Here is batch 6, final 1,500 words, of the script in flowing paragraphs. The jungle was silent in the aftermath of the battle, the tension still thick in the air despite the absence of the Tyrannosaurus. The pack lingered near the river's edge, their bodies still trembling with the adrenaline that had carried them through the fight. Nyx paced slowly, her golden eyes scanning the dark water where the beast had disappeared. It was gone, but they all knew. This was not the last danger they would face. Toru stood apart from the group, his hooves planted firmly in the damp soil, his breath steady. The pain in his muscles was deep, but it didn't matter. The moment he had locked horns with the Tyrannosaurus, something inside him had clicked into place. He had not just survived, he had fought back, protected the only family he had ever known. And now, as the jungle quieted once more, he knew something had changed. Rhilos approached, flicking his tail. "Never thought I'd see the day," he muttered, watching Toru with something almost like respect. "A Triceratops standing against a Rex? Ha! You've got more fight in you than I gave you credit for." Toru snorted softly. "And I thought you'd never admit it." Rhilos smirked before stepping away, leaving Toru to his thoughts. As the pack settled in for the night, Nyx sat beside him, silent for a while before speaking. "You proved something today," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Not just to the pack, but to yourself." Toru nodded, gazing into the jungle's depths. "I always thought I had to be something I wasn't, that I had to prove I was a raptor." Nyx turned her gaze toward him. "And what do you think now?" He exhaled, his breath steady. "That I don't need to be anything other than what I am." He met her eyes. "I am different, but I am not weak." Nyx studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Good." With that, she stood and returned to the others, leaving Toru to watch the stars flickering through the gaps in the canopy. He had come a long way from the fragile hatchling that had been left alone in the storm. He had found a place where he belonged, not because he had forced himself to fit, but because he had forged his own place. Days passed, and the pack began to settle into their new home by the river. The territory was rich with prey, and the dense jungle provided shelter from the harshest of elements. For the first time in as long as they could remember, they had a chance to thrive rather than just survive. Toru had taken on a new role within the pack, not as a hunter, but as a guardian. His presence alone deterred smaller predators, and when danger did come, he was the first to stand against it. The younger raptors began to follow his example, not mimicking his movements but learning from his instincts. When they played, they did not only practice speed, they practiced strength. They learned balance, defense, and patience. Even Rylos, once the most reluctant of the pack, had come to rely on Toru. When patrolling the edges of the territory, he no longer dismissed Toru's presence but welcomed it. They had learned to fight together, to work in tandem, speed and force, agility and power. Nyx watched this evolution from afar, a silent satisfaction settling in her chest. This pack had once been built on tradition, but now they were something new. One afternoon, as Toru stood near the water, drinking from the river's cool depths, a familiar sound reached his ears. A low, resonant call. Triceratops. He lifted his head sharply, his body instinctively still. The herd had returned, or perhaps it was a different one, passing through the jungle as his ancestors had done for generations. Nyx emerged from the brush, her gaze sharp. She had heard it too. The calls grew closer, and soon, shadows shifted through the trees. The herd moved with slow, powerful steps, their massive forms cutting through the dense foliage. Among them, the same female from before, the one who had called to him that night. She saw him immediately. Toru took a slow breath, his heart steady. He had made his choice once. Would he have to make it again? The female took a step forward, her expression unreadable. She rumbled softly. A question, an invitation. There was no demand, no pressure, only the choice. Behind him, Nyx and the pack waited. Toru turned his head, looking at them, looking at the only family he had ever truly known. And he did not hesitate. With a slow, deliberate motion, he stepped back, away from the herd. The female Triceratops studied him for a long moment before bowing her head in quiet acceptance. This time, there was no farewell, only understanding. She turned and rejoined the herd. Toru did not look back. Instead, he walked forward, back toward the pack, back toward his true home. Seasons passed, and the legend of the Triceratops who ran with raptors spread across the jungle. Other creatures whispered of the beast who had challenged the natural order, who had fought side by side with those who should have been his enemies, and who had become something neither herd nor pack had ever seen before. But to Toru, it was never about legend or legacy. It was about family. It was about finding a place to belong and forging something new. As the pack moved through the jungle, Toru moved with them, not behind, not separate, but as their equal. And as the sun set over the vast prehistoric world, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be.